Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Mohua Roy, Assistant Professor from the Department of Sociology from Lady Brabourne College, Kolkata. I am discussing a module entitled Women's Movement in India under the paper Social Movement. The module intends to introduce the three phases of women's movement in India, observe the various challenges that were posed by the women's movement to the dominant social, cultural and political trends of the country, and also observe the various issues that were raised at that point and the various achievements and failures of the movement. The movement has been classified into three phases, mainly three phases: the first, second and the third phase, and an in-between phase linking the first and the second phase. It is important to note that the classification of the phases is by no means a unilinear evolutionary trail which presupposes an ongoing proliferation or gradual proliferation of feminist consciousness, and also that one phase is qualitatively superior than the other. It is rather based on a contextual, chronological and thematic principle. Coming to the phases, now the first phase, the early years of the first phase may be contextualized in terms of the entire project of colonization as well as the nationalist discourse in India, and hence it was very closely linked to the ideals of nationalism as well as the social reform movement. It is very interesting to note that the women who were involved in the reform movement, they demanded civil and political rights under the leadership of the nationalists, and it actually led to a unique blend of feminism and nationalism. The key issues that were addressed during this period mainly revolved around uprooting the social evil of sati, prohibition of child marriage, sanctioning of widow remarriage, and also guaranteeing property rights to women through legislations, and also addressing the issue of education for women. Apart from the associations like Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, there was a group of women from the reformed elite families who, in an effort to create a distinct women's association, in an effort to unify the women irrespective of caste, creed as well as race, class, created women's organizations with the objective of empowering the women morally as well as materially. And such organizations include the Ladies Society, which was formed in 1882 by Swarna Kumari Devi, Sharda Sadan in Bombay, as well as Arya Mahila Samaj in Pune, also in 1882 by Ramabai Saraswati, and in 1910 we have Sharala Devi Chaudhurani creating the Bharat Stri Mahamandal. Now, all these women's organizations were founded with the objective of having a women's exclusive platform, because till then all women's meetings were also were held in conjunction with the meetings of the National Social Congress. So in order to have a platform of their own, such organizations were founded. The interwar years from 1917 to 1945 witness the women's movement deal with two significant issues, and that too quite successfully. That is the women's right to vote from 1917 to 1927, and also the reform of personal laws from 1927 to 29. With regards to the voting rights for women, we find that Travancore and Cochin were the first to offer women the rights to vote in 1920, and it was soon followed by Bombay and Madras in 1921, conferring similar rights to women. It was only in 1926 that we find in Bengal, women were allowed to vote, and that to propertied women. Now, it is also, in this regard, it is also important to note that this entire scenario was possible after a meeting that was held, in which Sarojini Naidu, along with an All India Women's delegation, and also Sarala Devi Chaudhurani with her representatives of Bharat Stree Mahamandal, met Montague and Chelmsford to appeal for women's suffrage. And however, the sex disqualification could be removed only after a delegation was sent to England to pursue the Joint Parliamentary Committee. 1917 also witnesses the initiation of the first All India Women's Association, which campaigned for voting rights for women, and it was initiated with the efforts, sincere efforts from Annie Besant, Margaret Cousins, and also Dorothy Jinna-Rajadasa. Now, as far as the reform of personal laws were concerned, we find that in 1927 the All India Women's Conference was initiated by Margaret Cousins, and with the objective to address the issue of education of women in India. And they soon realized that the issue of education was very much connected to other social issues of parda, child marriage, and other social customs. So they felt that they should campaign for things like they campaigned for a rise in the age of marriage for women, which also led to the passing of the Sharda Act of 1929, in which we find that the age of marriage for women was fixed at 14 and for men at 18, but later on again it got revised to 18 for girls and 21 for men. The All India Women's Conference also campaigned for reform of personal laws, but they soon met with resistance as far as a common civil law was concerned. So they thought of campaigning for reform in Hindu personal law, which actually dealt with prohibition of polygamy, for instance, and also advocating for divorce rights for women and also property rights for women. So all the relentless campaign for such reform finally led to the passing of the Hindu Code Bill in 1950, which was a series of laws which was passed to reform the Hindu laws. It is true that women had participated in large numbers during the Swadeshi movement as well as the Home Rule movement between 1905 and 1911. But it is an undoubted fact that women actually participated in large numbers. They came out from the domestic confines of their home only after the Gandhian call for Satyagraha. Salt Satyagraha, Rural Satyagraha, the civil disobedience movement, the Quit India movement, and so on. And we find that women during this phase, they organize meetings or rallies, and women's organizations like the Nari Satyagraha Samiti, the Mahila Rashtriya Sangh, they organized mass boycotts for foreign goods and products as well as liquor, foreign clothes and liquor. Mainly at this point we find non-violence being the dominant mode of protest. However, some also resorted to certain revolutionary and terrorist groups. In this context, we can also say that Subhash Chandra Bose, he encouraged the participation of women in the women's regiment in the Azad Hind Fauj. Again, undoubtedly, women, in spite of their mass participation, in spite of their exposure from their domestic confines, it also raised a number of questions as far as the women's participation in the contradictory realm of the public and the private was concerned. And we find that the nationalists reviewed the question of women's participation in the public realm in terms of their sustenance of their age-old feminine virtues, which was based on sexual purity and which could only be retained if they remained at home. So in this context, we can say that even though the political practices of both Mahatma Gandhi and Subhash Chandra Bose was quite oppositional to each other in most respects, somehow both agreed, or both kind of they had a similar notion about retaining the iconic image and iconic role of women as far as their participation in the nationalist movement was concerned. So in this regard, we can talk about two categories of women: the married women who was both a mother and a wife, and who could render their support in the nationalist movement, but by staying from their home front only. Whereas the other women was the unmarried or the widowed women who had severed their rights who had severed their familial ties for the nation, and they could render a direct support, or they could get involved in direct action as far as the nationalist movement was concerned. Over and all, the first phase of women's movement has often been criticized as being subservient in nature. Nevertheless, we find that it was marked by massive participation of women by coming out from their domestic confines, and for this they had to endure massive criticism, the magnitude and severity of which cannot be accounted for. It has often been said that somewhere in the first phase, the country's independence and the independence of the country and independence of women has got intertwined. But it is also true that at some major points it does overlap, but at other points it do oppose each other. Now, as far as the post-independence period is concerned, it is a very important phase because it kind of links the first and the second phase of women's movement. And we find that in the post-independence period, the cause for women remain an issue of concern. Even though there are certain efforts which are made, like there was the principle of gender equality introduced through the Fundamental Rights Resolution, which was passed in 1936, and which was later kind of transformed into a constitutional measure guaranteeing equality of the sexes in Article 14 and 16. And also we find that various administrative bodies were established to provide opportunity for women. Nevertheless, in the mid-1960s, we find widespread discontent among the people, especially among the youth and the working class. And this actually led to peasant movements. It led to the anti-price agitations in Kolkata, Bombay and Gujarat. Now, in the late 1970s, we find a number of movements in the radical left as well as in the socialist front, which has important implications for the growth of women's organizations during this phase. And one such movement is the Naxalbari movement, which was started in West Bengal and later spread to Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Bihar and Punjab. And gradually we find the women's organizations coming up, like Shromik Sangothon, finally leading to the Shahada movement of the 1970s. And then we have the self-employed women's association Seva by Ila Bhatt in 1972, finally leading to the trade union movement of 1972. And we also have the anti-price rise agitations, which was launched by the students in Gujarat and which was joined by the middle class women in massive numbers, and which later turned into the Navnirman movement of 1974. We also have the Sampurna Kranti movement of 1974, which was led by Jai Prakash Narayan, and in this period of 1973-74, we also find Mrinal Gore from the Socialist Party and many other women from the All India Communist Party coming together and forming the United Women's Anti-Price Rise Committee, seeking to protect the consumers. Along with that, we also have the Progressive Organization of Women, who also instigated criticism of the radical left. Apart from all these movements of 1973-74, we also have the Chipko movement of 1973-74, which is very important because it is one of the first environmental movement, non-violent environmental movement, which was started against commercial logging in Himalayas, and which actually symbolized a deep connection between women and nature. Ecofeminists like Vandana Shiva, they criticize modern science and technology as being Western, patriarchal and colonial in their project, because they exploit women and nature alike. And it is because of this that they feel that pursuing such a course of development is like shifting from the traditional philosophy, traditional Indian philosophy, which considers nature, that is Prakriti, as the ultimate feminine principle from which life emanates. So the post-independence phase again is not without its problems, and the first and foremost the problem that can be pointed out is the fact that in the post-independence phase there has been a shift as far as the attention of women is concerned. And unlike the first phase, where mostly the middle class, upper middle class women were the prime object of attention, in the post-independence phase we find that the attention shifts to the poor women. And even though attention was paid to the poor women, the urban and the rural working class women, somehow it was felt that the people could not identify with their problems. Their problems could not be identified, and even though various efforts were being made to bring an improvement to their situation, most of the efforts were welfare in their origin and not truly empowering them. So this was the first problem. The second problem was it was felt that there was a relative lull in the course of women's movement in the post-independence phase, and it was perhaps because there was no more a common enemy to fight against, and secondly the women's issue, or to be more specific, gender discrimination as an issue was not still being viewed as a separate issue, separate from the social and political issues. Now, the gravity of the various women's organizations in the first phase, as well as the real situation of the women, could only be gauged with the publication of the Towards Equality report in 1974. Now, in 1975, the United Nations organized the World Conference of Women in Mexico, and also declared 1975 to 85 as the International Decade for Women. Now, as a part of the World Plan of Action, the National Committee for the Status of Women was formed, and they actually published and presented the report on the status of women in the country in 1974, and this actually reflected, or it represented, the abysmal situation of women with regards to, one, the decreasing sex ratio, two, the increase in infant mortality and morbidity, and the economic marginalization of women, and finally the discriminatory and personal laws with its evil effects. The National Committee for the Status of Women had also come up with its solutions, and in this regard, and they had, they had talked about eradication of dowry, polygamy, bigamy, and child marriage. They had proposed various provisions like provision for creches for children, maternity benefits for women, good working conditions, and also equal pay for equal work, and also legal enactments in relation to divorce, maintenance, inheritance, adoption, and also tried to advocate for the universalization of education for women. However, we find that the report does not talk much about violence against women, experience of violence that women has in civil society, as well as violence inflicted by those in custody, and also in those in case of custodial violence. However, the report received a good response from the government and the media, as well as various agencies like the ICSSR. They actually came up with funds for advocating for and promoting research on various issues related to women. Apart from that, we find that the Towards Equality report created a new rational and moral basis for the emergence of autonomous women's organizations in women, and it kind of ushered in a new phase of women's movement in India. And the autonomous women's organizations, unlike the affiliated organizations, very much different from the structural mandate of the affiliated organizations, they dealt with only women's issues. They did not forget about the various multi-dimensional basis of discrimination with regards to caste, class, creed, and also they did not conceptually subordinate the women's causes to other causes for that matter. And the autonomous women's organization were mainly led by the middle class educated women who sincerely they worked towards the cause of sisterhood, facilitating the other women to speak, and also sometimes speaking on their behalf. So the autonomous women's organizations at this phase mainly addressed violence against women and sexual oppression of women in society, as well as the overtly patriarchal nature of society. And the various issues that they addressed with regards to violence against women was related to rape, dowry deaths, bride burning, and also sexual harassment at workplace, honor killings, sati, etc. So over and all, we can say that the second phase was successful in arousing the required the feminist consciousness among women, and also the various agitations led to a number of enactments of the 1980s. Now, such enactments were related mainly to the amendment of rape laws in 1983, which was ushered in by widespread discontent due to the Supreme Court judgment regarding acquitting 2 policemen of charges of rape in case of a minor tribal girl called Mathura, even though the High Court had actually convicted both the policemen. And this actually led to, massive agitations throughout the country from the autonomous women's organizations like Vimochana, Saheli, Progressive Organization for Women, and Forum Against the Oppression of Women in Bombay. So they launched widespread campaign against such an injustice, and they actually they were actually trying to redefine the issue of consent with regard to rape cases. Along with that, we have the Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961 getting revised in 1984 and 86, because the definition of dowry was very vague initially. So in order to modify and have a comprehensive definition of dowry, it was amended in 1984 and 86. Along with that, we have the 1971 Medical Termination and Pregnancy Act for safe scientific abortion, but it again got associated with female feticide, and for that agitations against female feticide, there was a central legislation for banning the prenatal sex selection tests, so that it cannot facilitate female feticide. Now, such laws, passing of such laws again was problematic, because the laws ultimately kind of retained the patriarchal structure, and it did not really identify the women's problem, the problems that women faced, and the failure of the laws could mainly be attributed to the fact that they were given as a token rather than for a real concern for women. So even the activists, without gauging the causes and consequences of these laws, often had to accept them as measures of empowerment for women. Now, it was soon realized that only passing of laws, implementing the laws without true consciousness among women and education will not be fruitful. So there was a need for legal literacy of women and also educating women. Gender sensitization of media as well as textbook was required, and it was with this aim in mind, and along with the government initiatives, the discipline of women's studies was initiated. And unlike the other social sciences, women's studies is definitely a value loaded discipline, because it strives to understand the problems of women in society. Veena Majumdar has truly said that the women's studies discipline is like an academic arm of the women's movement, which can actually transform women's perspective about themselves and also transform how people view women in society. So at that time, there was not much of women's studies centers, but two of them, two of the very important women studies research centers was one in SNDT Women's University in Bombay, and another one in the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TIS, also in Mumbai. But over the years, there has been a proliferation of women's studies centers and initiatives throughout the country, and there has been various funding agencies sponsoring research initiatives as far as women issues are concerned. The third phase witnesses the continued legal battle for enactments for women, and it was perhaps because the issues that were raised in the 1970s and 1980s could not still be resolved. So this actually led to again a number of enactments at this phase. The 30-year struggle leading to the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005, and the Preconception and Prenatal Diagnostic Technique Act of 2002, and the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act, Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act of 2013. Apart from this, we find that the 73rd and the 74th Amendment, Constitutional Amendment, actually reserves 33% seat for women in the Panchayat and Nagar Palika bodies, and this actually is very significant because it actually gives women the opportunity to participate in the decision making in local decision making bodies and as well as in governance. Nevertheless, the problem still lies with the 81st Constitutional Amendment Bill of 1996, which actually seeks to reserve 1/3 seat for women in the parliament, but which has unfortunately been unfortunately have received much resistance from various corners of the society. Apart from this, it is very important to mention one of the very important issues that has been raised during this time, and it has been the issue of caste. And the National Federation of Dalit Women, which was established in 1995, have actually somehow they have forced the activists to view the dimension of caste, because it was felt that the agenda of the women's movement have always been from the perspective of the upper class and upper and middle caste women, which often marginalizes and effaces the identity of the Dalit women. And the Dalit women have actually, they have pointed out to the threefold nature of oppression of women in society, Dalit women in society, and that is from the upper caste, upper class, and from the Dalit men themselves. So eminent social scholars like Gopal Guru and Sharmila Rege, they have advocated for a Dalit standpoint, which actually talks about the differently situated, it talks about the experiences of the differently situated Dalit women in society, where their problems are markedly different from those of the men as well as the non-Dalit women in society. Another very important movement of the 1990s and of the third phase has been the LGBT movement, and it has actually carved out a space, a platform for the political expression of the non-normative sexualities. It talks about the rights of the same-sex people as well as the hijras and the kotis, and so it has actually given the non-normative sexualities a platform to voice their opinion and problems. Finally, to conclude, we can say that the three phases, they represent, on the one hand, exclusion, violence against women, oppression, but that is also seen to be countered by excessive resistance from the women's movement. And even though it is sometimes felt that the multiple issues, the multiple situations with regards to the dimensions of caste, class, creed, race, language, has led to multiple and contending voices, which somehow appears to, reduce the unity, the solidarity of the women's movement that was a marked feature of the first and the second phase. But nevertheless, this is not a point of contention, this is not a point of concern, and something to be apprehensive about, because often such multiple consciousness, often such multiple voices, represents a maturity. It represents different levels of consciousness which might be constitutive for a nuanced political women's movement in the country. Thank you.